The ordinary night. In the early hours of March 8, 2014, the world was still asleep. Across much of Southeast Asia, it was a quiet Saturday morning. In Kuala Lumpur, the city lights glowed softly against humid air, and the routines of international travel moved forward with practiced precision. Nothing in the atmosphere suggested that this night would soon become one of the most scrutinized moments in aviation history. At Kuala Lumpur International Airport, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 was preparing for departure. The aircraft was a Boeing 777-200ER, registration 9M MRO. It was 11 years old, considered reliable, and widely regarded as one of the safest long-haul aircraft designs ever built. The Boeing 777 had logged millions of flight hours across the globe. No one at the airport that night saw anything unusual about this particular plane. It had completed its previous flight earlier in the day without incident. Maintenance logs showed no unresolved mechanical concerns. Fuel levels were appropriate for the journey ahead, with reserves exceeding regulatory requirements. Flight MH370 was scheduled to depart just after midnight, bound for Beijing Capital International Airport. The flight was expected to take a little over 6 hours, carrying passengers across the South China Sea, over Vietnam, and into Chinese airspace before descending toward Beijing in the early morning hours. There were 239 people on board. Among them were families returning home, business travelers, tourists, students, and airline crew. The passenger manifest included individuals from more than a dozen countries, the largest group being Chinese nationals. Some had taken photographs at the airport, unaware they were capturing what would later become the last visual record of their journey. Others were already asleep in their seats by the time the aircraft would later disappear from view. In the cockpit were 2 experienced pilots. The captain, a Malaysian national in his early 50s, had accumulated over 18,000 flight hours. He was a training captain, familiar with the Boeing 777 and the route to Beijing. The first officer, younger but also qualified on the aircraft, was nearing the completion of his transition training. Together, they represented what the airline considered a standard, competent flight crew. Shortly before departure, the flight attendants completed their safety checks. Doors were closed. Ground staff cleared the aircraft. Air traffic controllers confirmed the flight plan. Nothing deviated from expectation. At 12:41 a.m. local time, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 pushed back from the gate. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, its navigation lights cut through the darkness. The engines spooled up. The plane accelerated, lifted from the tarmac, and climbed smoothly into the night sky. From the perspective of those watching from the ground, it was just another aircraft departing into the familiar rhythm of global aviation. No emergency call was made. No distress signal was transmitted. No indication of trouble was reported. For the first several minutes, the flight proceeded exactly as planned. The aircraft climbed to its assigned altitude. Communication with Malaysian air traffic control was routine. The crew responded to instructions. Radar tracked the plane as it moved northeast, away from Kuala Lumpur and out toward the South China Sea. In modern aviation, this moment is typically unremarkable. Every day, tens of thousands of flights follow similar paths, guided by invisible networks of radar, radio communication, and satellite navigation. These systems are designed to create a sense of certainty, a belief that aircraft are always visible, always tracked, always known. That belief would soon be challenged. As Flight 370 approached the boundary between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace, it was preparing for a standard procedural handoff. This is a routine exchange that happens countless times each day. One air traffic control center relinquishes responsibility, and another assumes it. At 1:19 a.m., the cockpit acknowledged the final instruction from Malaysian Air Traffic Control. The transmission was brief. "Good night, Malaysian 370. Those words, spoken calmly and without urgency, would become the last known voice communication from the aircraft. Moments later, the plane's transponder, an electronic device that broadcasts identifying information to civilian radar, stopped transmitting. On air traffic control screens, Flight 370's data label vanished. At first, this did not immediately cause alarm. Transponders can fail, radar coverage can fluctuate, aircraft passing between control zones can momentarily drop off one system before appearing on another. Controllers are trained not to assume the worst based on a single anomaly. But as minutes passed, Flight 370 did not reappear on Vietnamese radar. Attempts to contact the aircraft were unsuccessful. Radio calls went unanswered. What began as a routine handoff slowly became something else, an uncertainty. Unknown to civilian air traffic controllers at that moment, military radar systems in Malaysia were still detecting something in the sky. These systems, designed for national defense rather than air traffic management, do not rely on transponder signals. Instead, they detect objects by bouncing radar waves off physical structures. According to later analysis, military radar showed an unidentified aircraft making an unexpected turn. Instead of continuing northeast toward Vietnam and China, the radar return appeared to reverse course. It crossed back over the Malay Peninsula, flew over land, then turned northwest toward the Andaman Sea. At the time, this information was not immediately shared, analyzed, or acted upon as a crisis. No one yet understood that Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 was no longer following its flight plan. Inside the aircraft, whatever was happening remained unseen. No emergency signal was activated. The aircraft did not descend rapidly. There was no indication of structural failure or explosive event. The plane appeared, at least from radar interpretation, to be flying under control. For hours afterward, the world would struggle to understand how a modern commercial jet could deviate so completely from its expected path without triggering immediate alarms. But that confusion began slowly. In Beijing, families arrived at the airport expecting to greet loved ones. Arrival boards showed delays. Airline staff reassured waiting passengers that the flight was en route. In Kuala Lumpur, airline operations staff noticed that Flight 370 had not checked in as expected with Vietnamese controllers. Attempts were made to establish contact. Messages were sent via aircraft data systems. There was still no response. At 6:30 a.m., the scheduled arrival time in Beijing passed. Flight 370 did not land. The aircraft was now officially overdue. What followed would become one of the largest, most complex, and most emotionally charged investigations in aviation history. An effort that would stretch across oceans, involve dozens of countries, and confront the limits of what modern technology can truly guarantee. In the hours after the disappearance, uncertainty spread faster than information. Families began to realize that something was wrong. Airline officials struggled to piece together incomplete data. Investigators would soon face a reality that defied assumptions about safety, surveillance, and control in the skies. And somewhere, far from any runway or radar screen, an aircraft carrying 239 people had vanished, leaving behind only fragments of signal, interpretation, and unanswered questions. The world would soon learn that even in an age of satellites and constant connectivity, absence itself can still be total. And sometimes, silence is the most difficult evidence to understand. The illusion of constant visibility. In the modern imagination, commercial aviation is often associated with omnipresent oversight. Passengers assume that aircraft are continuously tracked, that every movement is visible on screens somewhere, that deviations are immediately detected and corrected. This belief is reinforced by flight tracking websites, cockpit technology displays, and the sheer complexity of modern air travel. It feels impossible that an aircraft could simply disappear. Yet that confidence rests on assumptions rather than absolutes. To understand how Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 could vanish, investigators first had to confront how aviation tracking actually works and where its blind spots lie. Civilian air traffic control relies primarily on two types of radar: primary and secondary. Primary radar sends out radio waves that reflect off solid objects, detecting their presence without needing cooperation from the aircraft. Secondary radar, far more commonly used for civilian air traffic management, depends on transponders installed on aircraft. These transponders respond to radar interrogation by broadcasting identifying information, altitude, and position. Secondary radar is precise, efficient, and widely trusted. But it has one critical limitation: it requires the aircraft to actively transmit. When Flight 370's transponder stopped sending data shortly after 1:19 a.m., civilian controllers lost its identity on their screens. Without a distress call or immediate evidence of catastrophe, the disappearance did not instantly register as an emergency. In the world of aviation, small anomalies happen every day. Controllers are trained to respond methodically, not emotionally. What few outside military circles realized at the time was that not all radar systems are created equal. Military primary radar systems, designed to detect any aircraft entering protected airspace, do not rely on transponders. They can detect objects based on physical reflection alone. These systems, however, are not integrated into civilian air traffic control networks, nor are they continuously monitored for commercial aircraft behavior. In the days after the disappearance, Malaysian authorities revealed that their military radar had recorded a plane consistent in size and speed, with a Boeing 777 making a dramatic turn back toward the Malay Peninsula. This revelation reframed the entire narrative. Flight 370 had not simply vanished over the South China Sea. It had changed direction. The implications were profound. A controlled turn suggested intent or intervention, It implied that the aircraft systems were still functioning and that it remained airborne well beyond its last radio contact. It raised questions about who or what was guiding the aircraft after it deviated from its flight plan. Yet even this information came with uncertainty. Military radar does not provide the same resolution as civilian systems. The data was not recorded with investigative precision. Analysts could not definitively confirm altitude, nor could they rule out alternative explanations for the radar returns. The aircraft was not continuously tracked from that point forward. Instead, investigators were left with fragments. A turn here, a path there, gaps where nothing was visible at all. As news of the disappearance spread globally, pressure mounted for answers. Malaysia Airlines held its first press conference hours after the missed arrival in Beijing. Officials spoke carefully, emphasizing that communication had been lost and that efforts were underway to locate the aircraft. They avoided speculation. They had little concrete information to offer. Families gathered in airports and hotels, watching news coverage unfold in real time. Some clung to hope, interpreting the lack of wreckage as a sign of survival. Others sensed, even then, that something was deeply wrong. Behind the scenes, a massive international response was forming. Search and rescue operations began in the South China Sea, the area where Flight 370 was initially believed to have disappeared. Aircraft and ships from multiple countries converged on the region. Crews scanned the water for debris, oil slicks, or life rafts. Satellites were tasked with reviewing imagery from the hours following the aircraft's last known position. But the search area was based on assumptions that were already becoming outdated. As investigators re-examined radar data and flight logs, it became increasingly clear that Flight 370 had traveled far beyond its expected route. The challenge was determining how far and in which direction. The answer would not come from radar. It would come from space. Modern aircraft are equipped with satellite communication systems designed primarily for operational data and passenger services. These systems periodically exchange signals with geostationary satellites, even when no voice or data messages are being sent. Each interaction leaves behind a digital trace, known as a handshake. These handshakes do not reveal precise location. They do not transmit GPS coordinates. Instead, they record timing and signal characteristics that can be analyzed to estimate distance between the aircraft and the satellite. In the weeks after the disappearance, engineers from the satellite communications company involved began examining these handshake logs. What they found would fundamentally reshape the investigation. The data suggested that Flight 370 remained airborne for several hours after its last radio transmission. Even more startling, the timing and frequency shifts of the signals indicated that the aircraft did not fly east toward China. It flew south. Using complex mathematical modeling, investigators traced two possible arcs along which the aircraft could have traveled during its final hours: a northern arc stretching across Central Asia and a southern arc extending deep into the southern Indian Ocean. Over time, additional analysis eliminated the northern route as less consistent with available evidence. Attention turned to the south. This conclusion carried enormous consequences. The southern Indian Ocean is one of the most remote regions on Earth. Vast, deep, and sparsely monitored, it is an environment where wreckage can sink rapidly and remain undiscovered indefinitely. Weather conditions are harsh. Waves are powerful. The seabed is rugged and poorly mapped. If Flight 370 had indeed ended its journey there, the chances of recovery, or even confirmation, would be slim. For families, this shift in understanding was devastating. The idea that the aircraft had continued flying for hours raised painful questions. What happened during that time? Were the passengers conscious? Did anyone understand what was unfolding? Investigators were careful not to speculate publicly. The satellite data could not answer those questions. It could only suggest duration and direction, not experience or cause. Still, the realization that Flight 370 had not simply fallen from the sky marked a turning point. The disappearance was no longer just a tragic accident. It was a mystery that exposed the limits of surveillance, the fragility of assumptions, and the uncomfortable truth that even the most advanced systems can leave room for the unknown. As the search expanded and theories multiplied, one fact became increasingly clear. The world was no longer looking for answers in the air. It was searching for meaning in absence. And the deeper investigators went, the more they would discover that certainty itself was the rarest thing of all. Searching a moving horizon. When the search for Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 expanded beyond the South China Sea, it did so not with confidence, but with hesitation. Investigators were no longer following a trail. They were following probabilities. The realization that the aircraft may have flown for hours after its last radio contact forced a complete rethinking of where and how to look. The ocean beneath the satellite arcs was vast beyond comprehension, stretching across thousands of miles of open water where no shipping lanes passed regularly and where storms erased surface traces within hours. Unlike land-based disasters, there were no witnesses. No fireball had been seen. No emergency beacon had sounded. No floating debris field had appeared to mark the site of impact. The search became an exercise in reconstructing an invisible journey. In the days following the satellite data revelation, governments across the region began redirecting assets. Australia assumed a central role, given the likelihood that the aircraft had traveled south into its search and rescue responsibility zone. Naval vessels, long-range patrol aircraft, and surveillance planes were deployed to scan the ocean's surface. Crews flew grid patterns for hours at a time, peering through windows and sensor displays, searching for anything out of place. A fragment of metal, a cushion, an oil sheen that might hint at catastrophe below. But the ocean offered nothing. Weather conditions in the southern Indian Ocean are among the most hostile on Earth. Winds shift rapidly. Swells can reach towering heights. Cloud cover often obscures satellite imagery. Even when debris floats to the surface, currents can scatter it across hundreds of kilometers in a matter of days. Time worked against the searchers. Each passing hour reduced the likelihood that evidence would remain visible. Yet stopping the search was unthinkable. Families were watching. The world was watching. And investigators believed that somewhere, something remained to be found. The international nature of the operation introduced additional challenges. More than 24 countries became involved, each contributing assets, expertise, and intelligence. Coordination across languages, military structures, and political systems required constant negotiation. Information arrived unevenly, sometimes contradicting earlier conclusions, sometimes forcing revisions to public statements that eroded trust. Press briefings became carefully choreographed events. Officials spoke with deliberate caution, aware that every word carried weight. Too much certainty risked being wrong. Too little risked appearing evasive. For families desperate for clarity, these briefings often felt hollow, technical explanations delivered without the comfort of answers. Behind closed doors, investigators wrestled with a reality they could not escape. They were reconstructing events without the primary source of truth. The aircraft's flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, the so-called black boxes, remained missing. Without them, every conclusion was provisional. Radar traces could suggest movement, but not motive. Satellite handshakes could imply endurance, but not intent. As the surface search yielded no results, attention turned downward. If Flight 370 had indeed ended its journey in the southern Indian Ocean, its wreckage would likely rest several kilometers beneath the surface. The seabed in this region is a landscape of underwater mountains, trenches, and ridges shaped by tectonic forces over millions of years. Much of it had never been mapped in detail. Searching such terrain required specialized equipment. Autonomous underwater vehicles and towed sonar arrays were deployed to scan the ocean floor. These systems moved slowly, methodically, sweeping narrow bands of seabed at a time. Each mission could take days. Each scan generated vast amounts of data that had to be analyzed for anomalies, shapes that might resemble aircraft debris. The process was painstaking. False positives were common. Rock formations, shipwrecks, and geological features often mimicked man-made objects on sonar images. Each potential target had to be investigated, classified, and either confirmed or dismissed. For months, the search continued. Ships crisscrossed designated zones. Analysts refined models, adjusting assumptions about speed, altitude, fuel consumption, and wind patterns. With each refinement, the estimated crash site shifted slightly, sometimes by hundreds of kilometers. To those outside the investigation, these changes appeared as inconsistency. To those inside, they were signs of progress. The uncertainty weighed heavily on everyone involved. Search crews spent weeks at sea, operating in isolation under grueling conditions. Investigators worked long hours, knowing that each decision affected not only strategy, but the emotional state of families awaiting news. Officials faced criticism from media outlets and the public, accused of withholding information or mismanaging the response. Yet much of the frustration stemmed from a deeper truth. There was no clear path forward. Every assumption had to be questioned. Every piece of data had margins of error. Even the satellite analysis, the cornerstone of the Southern Route theory, relied on interpretations never before used to locate a missing aircraft. This was not a familiar investigation. It was unprecedented. For the families, time moved differently. Days blurred into weeks. Weeks stretched into months. Some families remained in Kuala Lumpur or Beijing, hoping proximity might bring information sooner. Others returned home, trying to resume daily life while carrying an unresolved absence that colored every moment. They watched press conferences closely, parsing language for hints of progress. A phrase like areas of interest could ignite hope. A statement about no new findings could feel like a personal blow. Many families struggled with the lack of tangible evidence. Without wreckage, without remains, there was no physical confirmation of loss. This ambiguity suspended grief in an unnatural state, neither hope nor acceptance, but something in between. Psychologists later described it as ambiguous loss, a condition uniquely resistant to closure. Some families turned inward, preserving their loved ones' rooms, keeping phones charged in case of a call. Others sought answers outward, demanding transparency, pressing officials for clarity, refusing to let the disappearance fade into abstraction. As months passed, attention from the global media began to wane. New stories emerged, other crises took precedence, but for those directly affected, nothing had changed. Flight 370 remained missing. Questions remained unanswered. The search continued, but without visible success. In the background, investigators began to consider possibilities that were difficult to articulate publicly. The absence of debris, the apparent control of the aircraft for hours, the silence from the cockpit, these elements did not point conclusively to any single explanation. Instead, they suggested a range of scenarios, each unsettling in its own way. But before theories could be fully explored, one thing was still needed above all else: confirmation. Proof that Flight 370 had indeed ended in the ocean. It was now being sought within. That proof, when it eventually came, would not arrive through sonar or satellite. It would wash ashore quietly, thousands of miles away, carried by currents that had no awareness of the story they were completing. Fragments without context. For more than a year after Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappeared, the ocean gave nothing back. Search vessels continued their slow, methodical sweep of the southern Indian Ocean floor. Sonar scans accumulated. Maps became more detailed. But the defining image that so often accompanies aviation disasters, floating wreckage, debris fields, confirmation, remained absent. Then, in July 2015, far from the designated search area, something unexpected appeared. On the eastern shoreline of Réunion Island, a French territory in the Indian Ocean, a local beachcomber discovered a large, weathered piece of aircraft debris lodged among rocks and sand. It was not immediately recognized for what it was. The object was battered, its edges worn smooth by months, perhaps more than a year, of exposure to waves and sun. When images reached aviation authorities, attention sharpened. The object was a flaperon. A flaperon is a component attached to the trailing edge of an aircraft's wing, combining the functions of a flap and an aileron. On the Boeing 777, it is a distinctive structure, large enough to be recognizable, yet rarely found detached unless subjected to extreme force. Investigators from France, Malaysia, and Boeing examined the debris closely. Serial numbers were absent, torn away, likely during separation or erosion. But internal markings, manufacturing details, and structural features were compared against production records. The conclusion, announced weeks later, was careful but clear. The flaperon was from a Boeing 777. Further analysis made it even more specific. It matched the configuration used by Malaysia Airlines, 777 fleet. While investigators stopped short of declaring it absolute proof, the evidence was strong enough to state that the debris was almost certainly from Flight 370. For the first time since March 2014, the disappearance had physical form. The discovery changed the emotional landscape of the investigation. For some families, the flaperon represented confirmation of what they had long feared, that the aircraft had ended in the ocean, and that survival was no longer a realistic possibility. For others, it reopened wounds, forcing a confrontation with loss that ambiguity had delayed. Yet even as it answered one question, the debris raised many others. How had a piece of the aircraft traveled thousands of kilometers from the presumed crash site to Reunion Island? Why had it taken so long to appear? And perhaps most troubling of all, why had so little else been found? Oceanographers began studying drift patterns, using computer models to simulate how debris could have moved through complex current systems. These models suggested that an impact in the southern Indian Ocean could plausibly result in fragments washing ashore on islands and coastlines across the western Indian Ocean months or years later. In the years that followed, additional debris was discovered. Fragments believed to be aircraft components appeared in Mozambique, Tanzania, South Africa, Mauritius, and other locations along the African coastline. Some were confirmed as likely originating from a Boeing 777. Others remained unverified or inconclusive. Each discovery was small: a panel, a piece of interior structure, a fragment of wing, never the kind of evidence that could reconstruct a crash sequence on its own. And none were found near one another. This scattered pattern suggested a violent breakup on impact with the ocean, consistent with a high-speed descent. But without the main fuselage or the black boxes, the circumstances of that final moment remained unknowable. Investigators faced an uncomfortable paradox. They now had proof that the aircraft had been destroyed at sea. Yet the debris did not lead them closer to the wreckage itself. Instead, it reinforced the likelihood that Flight 370 lay in one of the most inaccessible places on Earth. The official underwater search continued until January 2017. By then, approximately 120,000 square kilometers of seabed had been scanned, an area larger than many countries. The search had pushed the limits of deep-sea exploration technology, mapping regions of the ocean floor that had never been studied in detail before. Nothing conclusively identifiable, as Flight 370 was found. No fuselage, no engines, no black boxes. With no new areas of high confidence to explore, authorities made the difficult decision to suspend the search. They emphasized that suspension did not mean abandonment, that the investigation could resume if new information emerged. For families, the announcement felt like an ending without resolution. Some accepted it with resignation. Others rejected it outright, insisting that more could be done, that advances in technology or renewed effort might yet succeed. Advocacy groups formed, pressing governments to continue the search and release additional data. Amid this growing frustration, public attention began to turn toward explanation. If the aircraft had flown for hours under control, if systems had been selectively disabled, if no emergency call had been made, then what had happened on board? Investigators were careful. In the absence of definitive evidence, they framed possibilities rather than conclusions. Each theory was weighed against available data, acknowledging both its strengths and its weaknesses. Some explanations focused on technical failure. Could a catastrophic electrical malfunction have disabled communication systems while leaving the aircraft flyable? Engineers examined this possibility closely. Modern aircraft are designed with redundancy, multiple independent systems to prevent single-point failure. While unlikely, cascading failures could not be completely ruled out. Yet such failures typically generate alerts, alarms, or attempts at communication. None were recorded. Other theories examined the possibility of external interference. Could the aircraft have been hijacked? No group ever claimed responsibility. No demands were made. The flight carried no cargo of obvious strategic value, and the prolonged flight path did not align with known hijacking patterns. Attention inevitably turned inward, toward the cockpit. Investigators acknowledged that, historically, some aviation tragedies had involved deliberate actions by pilots, but they approached this line of inquiry with extreme caution. The captain and first officer had no publicly known history of violent behavior. Psychological profiling based on limited information was fraught with ethical and scientific pitfalls. Any suggestion of intentional action remained speculative. Each theory answered some questions while creating others. A technical failure struggled to explain the sustained flight. A hijacking struggled to explain the silence. Deliberate action struggled to explain motive. What remained consistent across all possibilities was the absence of certainty. Flight 370 had crossed a threshold where traditional investigation methods reached their limits. Without the aircraft itself, without recorded cockpit data, the case existed in fragments, physical, digital, and emotional. For the families, these fragments were not abstract. They were reminders that their loved ones' final moments were unknowable. That questions would likely outnumber answers indefinitely. As years passed, anniversaries became quiet markers of unresolved loss. Some families held memorials, others avoided the date entirely. The world moved on, but absence does not diminish with time. It simply becomes part of the landscape. And so the mystery of Flight 370 endured, not as a puzzle waiting to be solved, but as a testament to uncertainty itself. In the next part, we will explore the major theories in greater depth, not as conclusions, but as frameworks investigators have used to grapple with what remains unknown, and why none have been able to close the case. Theories in the absence of evidence. From the earliest days of the investigation, Flight 370 invited speculation. Every anomaly, the loss of transponder, the turn over the Malay Peninsula, the extended flight duration, became a point of focus, a puzzle piece whose placement remained uncertain. Investigators were careful to frame each possibility as hypothesis, acknowledging that none could yet claim certainty. Yet for families, the public, and analysts, these theories provided the only means to comprehend a journey that had ended in silence. One of the first explanations considered was catastrophic mechanical failure. In this scenario, a sudden malfunction, perhaps electrical, hydraulic, or structural, could have disabled the aircraft's communication systems while leaving it in controlled flight. Engineers examined the Boeing 777 systems extensively, noting redundancies designed to prevent single points of failure. Could a rare, cascading series of malfunctions have occurred, leaving the plane flyable but invisible to radar and satellites? Some experts argued it was technically conceivable, though improbable. Against it weighed the aircraft's smooth flight over several hours and the absence of emergency alerts, a pattern atypical for purely mechanical crises. Yet, without the aircraft itself, this possibility could not be excluded entirely. Another avenue of inquiry considered fire or smoke in the cockpit. Fires have caused prior aviation disasters, leading to incapacitation or erratic flight. Smoke detection in the cabin and cockpit triggers alarms, and crews are trained to respond swiftly. In Flight 370's case, no alarms were recorded externally. Satellite handshakes suggested steady flight rather than uncontrolled descent. While investigators speculated about gradual incapacitation from smoke or toxic fumes, such theories remain unverified. No evidence was ever recovered to confirm or deny these possibilities definitively. Hijacking emerged as a third theory. Aviation history contains instances of aircraft taken over for political or criminal purposes. The idea seemed plausible. Flight 370 could have been commandeered, forced off course, and flown to a remote location. Yet no group claimed responsibility, no ransom demand surfaced, and cargo manifests offered no obvious motive. Moreover, hijacking typically involves either communication or immediate crisis, yet Flight 370 remained silent, following a path inconsistent with known hijacking patterns. While not impossible, the theory faced gaps that could not be reconciled. Investigators also considered deliberate action by someone on the flight deck. Historical precedents exist in which pilots or crew have intentionally diverted or destroyed aircraft. This theory attracted attention in part because the deviation over the Malay Peninsula suggested intentional maneuvering. Psychological profiling was limited by available information, and investigators faced an ethical challenge in examining personal histories without public judgment. Supporters of this hypothesis cited the controlled flight and absence of distress calls. Critics noted the lack of motive, no manifesto, and the risk of assuming conclusions from absence rather than evidence. Each theory, when weighed against the physical debris that would later wash ashore, produced mixed conclusions. The flaperon on Reunion Island demonstrated high-energy separation consistent with water impact, but did not clarify cause. Drift models supported a southern Indian Ocean endpoint, but could not indicate whether the aircraft was intact or disintegrating midair. No recovered fragment provided cockpit insights or confirmed systems failure. Instead, each fragment illuminated the limitations of human investigation in the vast, hostile ocean. Even satellite data, while groundbreaking, could not close the gap. Analysts could reconstruct approximate arcs, flight durations, and altitudes, but could not ascertain the sequence of decisions made on board. The digital echoes, the so-called handshakes, became both evidence and enigma, suggesting continuity yet revealing nothing about human action. For investigators, these signals were simultaneously the clearest guidance available and a reminder of what remained unknowable. Debate over possible scenarios extended beyond technical questions to philosophical territory. How does one assign likelihood to an event with no witnesses, no audio record, and minimal physical evidence. The absence itself became the dominant characteristic. Unlike traditional crashes, which leave concentrated wreckage fields and black boxes, Flight 370 left a scattered trail of fragments across thousands of miles of ocean and beach. Each discovery confirmed location but not cause, presence but not intention. Theories proliferated because evidence did not converge. Each hypothesis had support in some data, but counterpoints in others. This is a hallmark of unresolved mysteries. They allow endless plausibility while refusing definitive resolution. Over time, unofficial theories circulated in media and online forums. Some proposed exotic scenarios, remote landings, unusual weather phenomena, or technological interference. None were substantiated by verified evidence. Investigators treated them with caution, often needing to publicly clarify that speculation does not constitute proof. Yet their existence reflected a broader human need. When concrete answers are absent, the mind seeks patterns, narratives, or explanations that can provide a sense of control over incomprehensible events. Flight 370 became not only an investigation, but a mirror for uncertainty itself. Throughout this period, investigators and families shared one common experience: the cognitive weight of ambiguity. Professionals faced unprecedented analytical challenges, sifting through radar, satellite, drift patterns, aircraft systems, and international coordination while knowing that each inference had limits. Families bore a different, yet equally profound, burden: the inability to mourn definitively, the impossibility of closure, the long stretching of time where hope and fear coexisted uneasily. Theories then became more than technical constructs. They became coping mechanisms, frameworks to render the unknowable slightly more intelligible. They were maps in a landscape without landmarks, signposts pointing toward questions rather than answers. And because the landscape was so vast and the clues so sparse, the journey through theory itself became a central component of the story of Flight 370. In reflecting on these theories, a pattern emerges. Each seeks to reconcile the facts that are known with the silence that dominates the unknown. The loss of transponder and radio contact, the turn over Malaysia, the hours of continued flight, the sparse debris field, the southern Indian Ocean endpoint, each element demands explanation. Each theory addresses some, leaves gaps in others. Together, they illustrate a profound lesson in modern investigation. Sometimes, even with vast resources, intelligence, and technology, events can exceed human understanding. The unknown persists not because of negligence or error, but because the world itself is vast, complex, and occasionally indifferent to observation. The human dimension of absence. Amid the technical reconstructions, satellite arcs, and sonar sweeps, the human story of Flight 370 quietly unfolded, far from the public eye. The passengers, invisible behind official statements and statistics, existed only as names and nationalities in news reports. Their absence, stark and persistent, weighed heavily on families, investigators, and the small circle of airline officials who tried to bridge the gap between uncertainty and information. In Beijing, the families of Chinese passengers converged in airport hotels, waiting for flights that would never arrive. The early hours of March 8 had offered hope, a routine departure, a journey across familiar skies. As news filtered in that the flight had not landed, that communication had ceased, confusion and disbelief took hold. Loved ones lingered in lobbies, clutching phones, notebooks, or passports, attempting to track each update, each piece of data, no matter how provisional. Some paced endlessly, the soles of their shoes worn thin by anxiety. Others sat silently, staring at departure boards or screens, listening for a voice, a signal, any sign that the narrative had not yet ended. Airline officials faced an entirely different, yet equally painful, wait. In Kuala Lumpur, crisis centers were activated. Employees sifted through flight logs, radar data, and passenger records, trying to reconcile the discrepancy between routine procedures and the aircraft's unexpected disappearance. Calls to governments, embassies, and international agencies arrived in rapid succession, each demanding clarity that could not be provided. The atmosphere was thick with tension, every word of communication carefully measured, every pause weighed for its potential to reassure or inflame. Staff worked through the night and into days, some clutching mugs of coffee that grew cold, others tracing the flight's intended path on maps that became progressively more complex as new information emerged. Investigators, too, were immersed in a landscape of ambiguity. Every piece of information required meticulous cross-examination, radar returns, satellite handshakes, and later flaperon analysis. Each anomaly sparked hypotheses, which then had to be rigorously tested against sparse data. Meetings stretched for hours. Teams from multiple nations argued, refined, and revised models. The pressure was immense, compounded by media scrutiny and political oversight. Investigators often carried a private burden of empathy. They understood, in ways the public could not, that every theoretical reconstruction represented lives, families, and grief suspended in the unknown. The psychological weight on families was profound and often isolating. Without bodies, without confirmation, grief existed in suspended animation. Some described it as ambiguous loss, a term psychologists use to convey the unique torment of mourning without closure. Parents preserved rooms as they had left them, siblings kept phones charged, spouses revisited emails and texts as if hoping for a reply delayed by circumstance. Ordinary rhythms, meals, work, sleep, were disrupted, interrupted by the persistent hum of uncertainty. Each news briefing was a double-edged sword, offering information, yet inevitably highlighting gaps and provisional conclusions. Every statistic and map became personal, a tangible reflection of a loved one still unaccounted for. Even when debris was discovered along distant shores, the emotional resonance was mixed. The flaperon on Reunion Island became both confirmation and new mystery. Confirmation that the aircraft had been destroyed at sea, and mystery in that it offered no insight into the final hours of flight, nor into the experience of those on board. Families confronted the simultaneous relief and sorrow of knowing the aircraft had ended its journey, while understanding that the answer did not resolve the more intimate questions. Were passengers conscious? Were they aware? Did they understand what was unfolding? These questions could never be answered with the fragments that the ocean delivered. The investigators' work became intertwined with human empathy. Analysis of satellite data, drift patterns, and sonar images was conducted in laboratories, aboard ships, and in offices around the globe. Each calculation represented more than a technical puzzle. It represented a promise to families that their loved ones had not been forgotten. Decisions about where to search, how to prioritize sonar sweeps, and which models to refine carried real-world weight. a balance between scientific rigor and the human cost of uncertainty. Airline officials and crisis coordinators, too, were bound by the challenge of communication under ambiguity. Every statement required careful phrasing, ensuring accuracy while managing public emotion. Officials walked a tightrope. Too much detail could mislead, too little could alienate. They became conduits between investigation teams and families, translators of technical uncertainty into human terms, their own stress invisible but immense. They learned that silence, too, carried meaning. Every pause in a briefing could be interpreted, and misinterpretation often amplified anguish. The emotional labor of maintaining composure while conveying incomplete truths became a central, unrecognized facet of the response. In some families, grief manifested as meticulous ritual, almost compulsive observation of flight information, ocean currents, or debris reports. Parents of children on board noted every update on the flight path, every satellite handshake timing, imagining what it might indicate about each hour of the journey. Spouses collected news articles, watched maps with obsessive attention, and spoke quietly to themselves about potential scenarios. Siblings shared memories, photographs, and the faintest traces of hope that perhaps the aircraft had diverted to an unknown location, however improbable. Other families expressed grief through quiet resignation. They accepted the lack of closure as a permanent state and adjusted their lives to accommodate it. Yet even resignation did not eliminate the ache. Anniversaries became temporal markers, news cycles prompted renewed awareness, and every unrelated aviation incident triggered reflection. The absence of certainty became a permanent companion. Investigators, while distant from the immediate family grief, experienced their own emotional landscape. Months and years of methodical work, cross-continental coordination, and repeated simulations could not deliver the resolution they desired. They carried knowledge that fragments existed, that data could suggest probable arcs, and that the aircraft had likely ended its journey far from human reach. Yet none of this could fill the gap left by a complete understanding. Many recounted the subtle, persistent weight of working with absence itself, of managing immense technological, logistical, and human complexity without ever achieving closure. Together, these overlapping experiences of families, investigators, and officials illustrate a profound truth about Flight 370. The human impact is inseparable from the technical mystery. It is impossible to narrate the story of the disappearance without acknowledging the emotional currents that run beneath the procedural and investigatory details. Every calculation, every piece of debris, every satellite signal intersects with grief, hope, and uncertainty in ways that no statistic can fully convey. And in the quiet spaces between updates, between debris discoveries, between satellite signals, the most human element emerges: the enduring confrontation with absence itself. The passengers, the families, the investigators, all are bound together in a shared experience of uncertainty. The narrative of Flight 370 is not only a story of technology and oceanic expanse, but also a meditation on how humans encounter the unknowable, how they bear questions without answers, and how, even amid global coordination and advanced tracking systems, silence can define an event as profoundly as any signal. In the following part, we will explore the reflection and meaning of Flight 370's disappearance, examining why some mysteries endure in the modern age, how absence shapes our perception of safety and knowledge, and why even after years of investigation, the story remains open-ended. Reflection, absence, and the limits of certainty. The disappearance of Flight 370 was, in many ways, a confrontation with the limits of modern certainty. In an era defined by global positioning, radar coverage, and satellite communication, the world had come to assume that human movement, especially that of large, commercial aircraft, could always be monitored, accounted for, and traced. Yet in the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean, amid the layers of technological sophistication, an aircraft and 239 souls slipped beyond observation, leaving behind only fragments and a profound uncertainty. This confrontation forced reflection on multiple levels: technological, human, and philosophical. Aviation systems, no matter how advanced, rely on redundancy, protocols, and human interpretation. Flight 370 exposed the reality that redundancy cannot fully compensate for the unforeseen combination of events, and that protocols, no matter how meticulously designed, operate within constraints. The transponder system, reliable yet dependent on continued operation, the radar networks, dense yet incomplete over vast oceans, and the satellite communications, innovative yet imprecise, all failed to provide definitive guidance at the moment it was most needed. Technological reflection, however, is only part of the story. The human encounter with absence, the experience of not knowing, defines the disappearance in ways that extend beyond measurement. Families were left in suspended grief, a form of mourning without resolution, caught in the liminal space between hope and despair. Investigators faced the peculiar tension of working tirelessly, generating detailed models and analyses, yet ultimately confronting a fundamental void. The aircraft itself remained undiscovered, its story incomplete. Officials carried the weight of communication responsibility, conveying fragmented and provisional information, knowing that every word could alter hope, doubt, or anguish. Even as international search operations charted the seabed and debris washed ashore across islands in the Indian Ocean, the physical evidence only deepened the sense of ambiguity. The flaperon, battered and worn, confirmed that Flight 370 had ended in the ocean. Yet its journey to Reunion Island, the dispersal of other fragments, and the vast areas yet unexplored served as constant reminders that certainty is often provisional, that confirmation does not equate to understanding. Investigators could point to probable locations, plausible arcs, and likely trajectories, yet each conclusion remained contingent, susceptible to revision, and inherently incomplete. The narrative of Flight 370 also invites reflection on the limits of narrative itself. Humans are storytellers by nature. We construct meaning from sequences, causality, and connection. Yet Flight 370 defies straightforward storytelling. Cause and effect are obscured. Decisions made in the cockpit, systems failures, and environmental conditions remain speculative. What is known is tangible: departure from Kuala Lumpur, last voice communication, radar anomalies, satellite handshakes, scattered debris. But between these markers stretches a void, a narrative lacuna that resists filling. This void challenges conventional understanding, reminding us that not every story can be neatly completed, not every sequence can be fully reconstructed, and not every absence is resolvable. The societal implications of the disappearance are equally profound. Flight 370 undermined a fundamental expectation that in an interconnected, monitored world, human activity is trackable, comprehensible, and controllable. Airlines reassessed procedures, aviation authorities reviewed global tracking capabilities, and international collaboration on long-range search protocols was accelerated. Yet even as systems improved, the psychological impact of the unresolved mystery persisted. Confidence, once implicit, became provisional. The world recognized that absolute oversight is aspirational, not attainable, and that silence, absence, can dominate even the most technologically mediated environment. Reflection extends to the emotional cadence of those directly affected. For families, investigators, and officials, years have passed without finality. Anniversaries mark absence rather than remembrance. Each new fragment or revised analysis stirs both hope and grief. The human psyche navigates a paradox, a need for closure that remains unattainable and a necessity to live alongside ambiguity. In interviews and personal accounts, many describe a sense of ongoing tension, a quiet vigilance for news, a continuous calibration of hope, a mindful endurance of the unknown. In broader terms, Flight 370 embodies the tension between expectation and reality. Humans organize their environment through observation, measurement, and prediction. Air travel, in particular, depends on these structures. Flight 370's disappearance shattered the assumption of predictability. It revealed that, despite technological sophistication and global coordination, certain events exist beyond immediate comprehension. The story of Flight 370 is therefore not just about an aircraft or its passengers. It is about the inherent limits of knowledge, the delicate boundary between control and unpredictability, and the ethical and emotional navigation required when certainty is denied. There is also a meditation on time and scale. The ocean, indifferent to human schedules, disperses evidence along currents that defy observation. Days and months stretch, sediment and corrosion erase immediate traces, and spatial vastness renders human effort small in comparison. Time does not clarify the narrative, it complicates it. Each anniversary, each passing year, accentuates the tension between memory and absence. The story persists not only in investigative logs and international reports, but in the lived experience of those waiting, watching, and hoping. Ultimately, Flight 370's narrative ends, not with a conventional conclusion, but with quiet reflection. The investigation, the debris, the satellite data, and the theories provide partial glimpses. They illuminate technological capability, human response, and the painstaking work of global collaboration. Yet they leave the core mystery intact. The final hours, the human experience on board, the precise cause of disappearance, all remain unknowable. The silence at the center of Flight 370's story is not merely the absence of signal or communication. It is a presence in its own right, shaping thought, emotion, and understanding in ways that no recovered wreckage or data could fully resolve. In contemplating Flight 370, we are confronted with the limits of observation, the weight of uncertainty, and the resonance of absence. We are reminded that, even in an age of satellites, surveillance, and instantaneous communication, mysteries endure. Some questions have no answers. Some journeys leave no markers. And some events exist as persistent enigmas, their significance defined not by resolution, but by the human engagement with uncertainty itself. This reflection, like the ocean, is vast and quiet, carrying the traces of Flight 370 across years, minds, and memories. It leaves a residue of thought, a lingering awareness that the world, however interconnected and technologically advanced, can still harbor the unknown. The story closes not with finality, but with contemplation, an open horizon where absence itself is the enduring presence, and silence is the last, unanswerable testimony. The quiet horizon. In the final act of the story, there is no spectacle, no sudden revelation, no definitive return to the world we recognize. There is only the horizon, wide, unbroken, and indifferent. It is over this horizon that Flight 370 likely disappeared, leaving behind an expanse of water so vast that the human imagination strains to comprehend it. And it is across that same horizon, in thought and memory, that families, investigators, and the wider world continue to reach, seeking a presence that no longer exists in physical form. The ocean is a subtle narrator. Its currents carry fragments slowly across thousands of kilometers, eroding edges, smoothing surfaces, and distributing evidence in patterns that defy expectation. The flaperon on Reunion Island and the other small fragments found along distant shores are reminders of connection and distance, of impact and dispersal. Each piece tells a story not of human intention, but of natural movement, persistence, and transformation over time. They are quiet witnesses to a journey that will never be fully traced, physical traces of absence rendered tangible only by their discovery. For the families, the years have transformed grief into a complex rhythm. Days and nights fold into one another, anniversaries punctuate absence, and hope exists in a fragile, almost suspended state. Some maintain routines as a lifeline, trying to reclaim normalcy while living in proximity to unanswered questions. Others immerse themselves in the investigation, tracking news, updates, and research with painstaking care. Their lives, once ordinary, are forever threaded with uncertainty. Each fragment found, each technical report released, becomes a moment of emotional recalibration, an ephemeral point where the unknown is momentarily made real before receding once again into abstraction. Investigators carry a parallel burden, though less visible. They inhabit a world where every data point is analyzed, every hypothesis weighed, and every assumption questioned. Satellite arcs, radar traces, and sonar images are tools, but they are also reminders of the limits of perception. Months of painstaking analysis produce partial truths, plausible reconstructions, and statistical probabilities, but never definitive narratives. Their work is a meditation on the interface between certainty and ambiguity, a constant negotiation with absence. Each decision about where to search, how to model trajectories, and how to interpret signals carries weight not only for the investigation, but for those who live in its shadow. The global community, observing from afar, experiences a quieter but persistent resonance. Flight 370 disrupted assumptions about safety, oversight, and predictability in aviation. It forced a reconsideration of what is known, what can be measured, and how reliance on technology intersects with the unpredictable realities of the natural world. It revealed that even sophisticated systems, satellites, and international coordination cannot always prevent the unknown from intruding upon human life. And it reminded the world that silence itself, absence, invisibility, unknowable consequence, can carry profound meaning. In contemplating the story's final act, there is no need for dramatization or sensationalism. The disappearance is already dramatic in its implications. The calm, careful reflection of oceans, skies, and waiting rooms tells as much of the story as any data chart. It is a story of ordinary nights disrupted, of expected arrivals unmet, and of the quiet weight of unanswered questions. It is a story of humans navigating uncertainty, of grief sustained across years, and of investigation conducted within the narrow corridors that partial evidence allows. The narrative ultimately closes in reflection, with no resolved plotline, no last word from cockpit or passenger. Flight 370 exists now in fragments, in arcs traced by satellite, in scattered debris, and in memory. Its story is experienced through absence, the silence of airspace, the emptiness of a hotel lobby in Beijing, the faint touch of cold ocean water against a fragment of flaperon far from its point of origin. Its presence is known only through what it left behind and the human effort to interpret it. And in that effort, the story achieves its resonance. It becomes less a tale of disappearance and more a meditation on the limits of knowledge, the persistence of uncertainty, and the quiet endurance of those who continue to live with what cannot be resolved. The final image is simple: a horizon that stretches unbroken, gray and pale at dawn, with waves folding upon themselves and carrying secrets beneath a surface that neither confirms nor denies. Somewhere beyond sight, Flight 370 rests in the ocean's depth, unreachable, unknowable, yet profoundly present in thought and memory. There are no conclusions, no explanations that satisfy fully. There is only contemplation, a recognition that, even in an age defined by observation, some mysteries remain, and that the human experience of loss is inseparable from the vast, patient, and silent world that surrounds us. And so, the story ends quietly, without closure. It ends in reflection, in the echo of absence across oceans, across years, and across the minds of those who continue to search for understanding. Flight 370 remains a testament not to what can be fully known, but to the persistent, inescapable presence of what cannot.